Today's lecture, draw along lecture, is on the Villa Rotunda, Renaissance villa just out of Vicenza, which is a bit outside of Venice, Italy, northern Italy, by an Italian Renaissance architect named Andrea Palladio, one of the most significant Renaissance in terms of architectural precedent in informing thousands of other buildings just like this one. The original name is the Villa al Americo, Capra Valmarana, but really known as the Rotunda in historical terms. It's inspired, again, thousands of buildings. Itself was probably inspired mostly by the Pantheon and other sort of pure volumes in classical antiquities. So we're going to work with this with design markers again, 2 through 9. And we're going to do it from a position where we're walking up from the city of Vicenza, pedestrian path, and then we're going to rotate the volume, which is a sort of a pure cubic volume. So we see one major side, a bit of the left end, and then a bit of the right. So there's 4 equal porticos that pop out, and we'll see a major view of this one, a secondary view, and then a minor view of the one on the right, and obviously we'll miss the 4th one on the backside. But it could rotate any direction, and it holds that sort of bilateral symmetry. It's not perfect in terms of its architectural presence because it adapted to the site. So there's modifications per elevation, and then landscape changes in all 4 phases. So our goal, again, is to this view. So relative to our view shed, the horizon line will be beneath the actual plinth or second story where the architecture and the main rooms are found. There's a lower level, in a sense, like a basement level before you rise up to the piano nobile, the nobility platform for the housing here. It was built on top of Little Hill and majestically overlooks the city of Vicenza, which is about 3/4 of a mile away. So that means that when we draw, for instance, the top line of the stair over here, that's above our eye height. You can see the scale of an individual here. So right about halfway up on these piers at all 4 quadrangles here, which we'll draw in, is the horizon line. So with your 20% here, just mark that across. And then using the diagonal from the roof up here, we see the tick mark taking us back towards a point just off the left side of the page, and then the one that's further away, which connects these 2 corners, is well off the page to the right. Now we want to make sure we treat all of our horizontals rushing back to that vantage point, rushing back to this vanishing point, and now the corner of the box then comes up towards that point from this side, and then rushes back to the right over here. That's our primary box here. It's got a pyramidal pitch to its roof that pitches up from both sides. So those diagonals are not part of our typical projection back to the vanishing points. Then the rotunda is well above the horizon line. So that is simply a disc that supports the shallow dome up here. So from this corner to this corner, we're going to arc up and show the underside of that rim of that drum. It goes in a cylindrical volume around the whole place there. And on top of that sits a very shallow drum, which was actually completed by Palladio's student, Scamozzi, because Palladio didn't live to see the finality of the building in terms of its presence on the site. So that shallow dome was an inference from his student. And then the other main volume we see is a box that juts out in the left side and on the front here. So once we work from the corner back to those pieces, we'll see this connection to that point, this connection to this point, and then drop that down and drop this down. And so we can find these boxes then, which then project out from the right vanishing point and from the left vanishing point out. So we have a small box, the main box, a small box again. It comes up, again, vanishing from this left vanishing point. And then at the top of the entablature for the columns, It floats back to that right vanishing point and then completes that front box right at the edge of that last column here. So we have now the frontal box, portico, which we could have drawn from any one of the sides here. We're going to draw it such that the more forested area is over to the right, and then what it was set up before, there's a formal access from the city to the right, and then the sort of farmland that goes off to the other two areas pitch off to the left and the back of the actual tempietto here. So again, the major box, two secondaries here, and then we see a bit of the third, where the major box of the home ends up on this point, and then this line that goes all the way across through the box pops out here to show its twin on the other side. And the only bit we see there is that end column in terms of how we rotated the box for view. Obviously, if you shifted positions here on the site and moved more to the right, you'd see less of this, and this would grow in presence. If you came right in the middle, it'd be an elevation. So it's best to always be a sort of diagonal version on something that's orthogonal so you get more of the volumetric play. Now we step down, and there are piers that guard the edges of the stairway that takes you from that second floor and a whole series of stairs, probably 20 steps to get up to that piano nobile on all four sides. So bracketing those on the front here are the two front feet of those that rush back to our horizon line again, and then meet the box, and this one rushes back and meets the box. So dropping those corner points down, they run there, they come back to this corner, to this line, and then project over, go back to the left vanishing point, and then project out all the way over here to the side. So we'll see the one wall, the sort of wing wall that comes out at the base on the model. This one's projecting sort of directly to us. This one's the same positioning, but a little bit further away. And this one's perpendicular to us, so we see it more as a flat wall in front of us. And then its twin is far in the background, but we do see the face of that twin projecting back, and the two are again horizontally going back to that same vanishing point. Now, if you take this base wall, which again shelters the stair on either side, and take it all the way through the building, it will then project out over here and show its twin on the other side of the project. And that runs up about that far away. So even though this is a much smaller space on our sketch, it will read as the same distance because now we're looking at it in perspective. And now we can kick up to an angular point. We did the rotunda here, we did a dome on top of that. Now we have triangulated elements for the pediments that sit on top of this. If we didn't have the tick marks, which are going to give us an easy way to find that, if you're doing this from a sketch on site and you've got your boxes laid out, you can always find the center of a box in perspective by simply bisecting the box. And that gives you the perfect center line for the pediment to rise up and come back down. So it's not vanishing to our horizon line because it's diagonal projection. Same is true over here. We can bisect this and then rush up to this point, and then we find that pediment rising up. The top of it, though, is horizontal, and we'll come back to the house proper and then angle back down on this side. And we don't see much of that all here. We just see the corner statuary on this one. We don't see much of just a little tick mark rise of that diagonal coming back there. And that kind of completes all the boxes that we're going to work with. Our site will vanish off, and right at the horizon line here, it dips down into the farmland sort of valley. So that's kind of a break point of a little sidewall. And we'll see a little bit of ribbon of trees in the distance, which will give us a tone to hold on to. And then closer on this side of the temple over here, the villa is an array of forested trees, which come all the way down to that grade line and give us a nice value later on. So when we get to the 3s and 4s, we'll add that value in this zone over here. So hold that for later. So now we can probably move up to 3 and start to articulate the details within this before we start to assign too much value. And so our key is that it's used with a ionic order here. So it's better, richer, wealthier in a sense than the Doric. It's a little more elegant, more vertical. And then that's the really most maximum view of detail in the building outside the statuary, which are statues of ancient deities. So Palladio was doing this as sort of an essay for Paolo Almerico, who was a priest of the Vatican, who had retired that year and was a legal secretary to the 2 popes before him, Pope Pius IV and Pope Pius V. So he amassed enough personal wealth to build this kind of emblem of all of Palladio's great ideas for the villas he'd been doing in the Veneto, in this area of northern Italy there. And that was written in a book called The 4 Books on Architecture, which is sort of architecture in Western culture has got a series of texts that are written by architects. They're sort of biblical in terms of the presence and the language they portray, so that the influence of this stretches all the way to the Americas and our White House in terms of the language of a type of formal volume with projections in the classical language. So it's referred to at the White House as a Neoplatoon piece of architecture, as well as some of the other buildings you find on our coins and our bills are classically introduced from Thomas Jefferson being over in France at the time and him studying the classical antiquities and being a fan of Palladio himself. So we'll come in with the tick marks here and we'll show the edges of our columns. Again, we're going to make them a little bit fatter now because we can always bring the value back in. So always draw outside the tick mark lines as we move across. And this is a hex style, 6 columns in a row. And that takes us to the edge over here. And now the same thing will happen here. It's going to run over and hit its entablature. This side, we're only going to see the 1, and because it's in perspective, the heights of these are going to push back in space to this point and then come over to the height of the column there. So that's the total height of what that edge column will be for us. And on this side, if it wraps around and has this piece, vanishes back, then to the right vanishing point, then to the left vanishing point, then to the right vanishing point, we can then find the heights of the columns here before it reaches its pediment. And here, because they're all collapsing on top of each other, we never see a full column except for the end one. So we'll do the 1 full, and after that, it's just the line work to complete that 6 style temple front on that end. So it's fairly condensed, but that's the exact same language we see here in the front. And then 1 column of that wrapping around. And then in terms of fenestration, fairly simple here. It's sort of not a full-fledged, the actual owner, Paolo Almerico, also passed before it was completed. So that's where you get the other names of the Capra, Valmoranas, as well as the other owners over the time here. And now it's been kind of restored after its, I believe it was the 400th anniversary in the 1980s when they came back and decided to bring it back to a sustainable touristic presence now in the annals of architecture. So simple volumes here of windows on that 2nd floor, the basement or the lower level between that. Each side portico has got an arch through it. We'll see a side view of this one. So we'll see this and a little slight opening, which we'll value in later. The windows come over here on this side. The same window, then we see just a little sliver of it. And then it continues into the porch here and allows us to see its main entry door and then 2 second windows. So it's important for us to, again, show a volume and show space inside the volume with light, shade, and shadow to push us into the building a bit. Because we're not right on axis looking at this, the front door, which is on axis, is actually perceived between the 2nd and 3rd column. So there's a dark area here. We'll do a miter around the statue in front of it. And then we see this window on this side pushed over. And then finally the one on this edge right there. Carry through most points. And up in the attic story, there are a band of doubled windows. up on both sides. We turn around the corner, we see just a little sliver of them up at that attic level. And we'll save these later, the statues to adorn all the edges of the pediments, the crown of the pediments, and then the edge of the wing walls that project out into the landscape. So we can move to 4 now and start to assign our light, shade, and shadow here and what we want to do. And typically, when you do something very classical, you want to do the front elevation to it. So here's the western face facing back into the town. And so it's got great light projecting on it. So we'll have the left sides now, everything that faces the opposite direction perpendicular to it as a value in our 40%. So we can start just simply by washing back this side. Make sure you keep the edges nice and crisp. You're working with really great, strong, simple platonic shapes here. And save your whites within this area because we need to have the light come through this facade and light up part of this arch. So the top won't receive it, but the bottom will. And then we'll go dark through the opening. So we create a little bit of a mass here now where light's hitting part of it. So this is where you want to make sure you look at the photograph and follow along here and save those values when you can. And we'll come here, and that's definitely not receiving light. And now the same thing over here, this whole side is in shade. So we can pull those lines over here. And these will fade to be lighter because it's simply number 4 here. Then we use tones later on to stiffen up the edge as we make it around the corner there. Like most of the things we draw, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site referred to as the city of Vicenza and the Palladian villas, the Veneto. So whenever you visit Venice, certainly make a trip out to Vicenza and get your map guide to see all the possibilities of the many homes he built in his hometown of Vicenza, as well as in the area of the agrarian communities and the new wealth, the aristocracy of farmland, where he's doing this idea of classical language now for the people, for the merchant class as well, and not just for the noblesse and royalty. So this whole side is, again, in shade over here. So the underside of the pediment, the entablature goes dark as well. And then the faces of the brick walls over here, as the stair comes down behind this wall, we see the stair open up in front of this wall. So this one is triangulated as the stairs come down. We'll infill that with a value. And the stairs are tricky because they're typical tread riser ratios to get the anthropomorphic quality of somebody to walk up them without thinking about the stairs. And there's so many here. From a distance, it kind of looks like a gray tone. So if you simply take the tip of the chisel and just do a series, we're not going to try to be too accurate to the same number that are there, but to give the idea of a graphic that in fact they are treads. Just move those across for now. And we'll do a little throw shadow line, which will be on a diagonal pitch because it's going up on a diagonal, and that'll help throw the volume going back. And that's the last of our left sides we're dealing with. So now we've got the shade side. That's assuming the shadow side, what's cast from the actual architecture onto the building. So the biggest one for us is right in front. So if it's coming not directly in the front of the building from the side, it would take this open box and cast a shadow down just past this window and then drop down straight. So we can come from this side and just value this all out. For now, just again, we'll eclipse this with darker tone a little bit. And there's no cast shadow we see here because there's no play of light here. So we'll have a little bit of a cast up on this roof line as this wall throws a shadow onto the roofing detail there. And then we got the shadow line for the drum of the dome, which again, get that fish hook going here and wrap that around so it really spins well. And then here's that arc. It starts over here, and as you move it, it curls back down. So this side of the dome is receiving less light than the bright side here. And the same is true for the dome itself, which will have kind of a hot spot looping around on that side. So we get the light hitting this on the rotunda, we get the light hitting that on the edge of a half ball up there. So maybe drop back down really quickly here to a 3, and we'll just assign sort of a normative value, again, kind of like the stairs, but with the flush of the pen tip itself, because the entire tile roof is a darker tone than the sort of tan stucco. We can simply line that out. When you draw little bits of line and leave white in it, that'll help showing that it's all small pieces put together up there. It's not quite as monolithic as the stone facing and stucco. Yeah, we see a little bit here on the top lip here of that side of the roof line. Now going back to the 40%, now we go behind the columns because there's all cast shadow on that back wall. So this wall goes behind the portico and needs to receive a tone. What we're going to do is we're going to start up top with the chisel part of the 40 and simply start at the bottom of the entablature. There's a little bit of a line where we get the thickness of the entablature. So we see the face of it, then the underside of it. Once we get past the underside, just hold it on that edge and then pull it away. So it's deeper and darker underside of that canopy for now. And so it makes, again, the sense that the light's coming down, bouncing off the floor and starting to light the wall that's in shade. And then at one point, we even get a version of the column itself throwing a shadow line on that back wall. So the light comes down here and is stronger, just the column width there, then continues. So having that little bit of white show looks like one of the columns is actually throwing a shadow on here. So the angle of it is forcing that to have its edge condition. So we'll use our other ones to kind of enunciate that. That's the other twin arch on the underside here, being darker than the rest of the space there. So we have light going through that. And now we have a bright column against a bright face, against another well-lit column. And then finally, we've got our first major dark, which is going to pull the building off the paper around the edge of these little statues. So keep them white here for now. And now it's just kind of a off the chisel, just starting with a number 4 and kind of zoning in an array of dark landscape in the distance. Make sure you hold that edge, and we'll come back and shape it later, but this is going to sort of define that this is a nice dark area which will set the building off. We'll do the same for this side. In the distance, the foliation is still really stronger and darker than the architecture. So that'll give us a sense that there's something moving from our foreground toward the background. And now at the base, there is a walkway which boxes around the whole building. So coming off that right vanishing point, carry that line all the way over to here, and it meets this point over that at this level. So this is going to be grass inside of that. In front of here is a little bit of a thin walk we see in perspective that wraps around and boxes in the entire space and then turns and goes back. So we leave that part white, and now we're going to have this be a nice dark aspect too. So for now, we're just going to zone that in with a 40% and come back and give it some more strength later with cast shadows from the buildings. There's also the Palladians from England that made the move of pushing that language out. So for instance, Chiswick House or Merworth Castle in Kent are great Palladian structures. Christopher Wren and Nicholas Hawkmoor were a fan of Palladio's architecture, Inigo Jones, and so it spread as a language which seemed to be a palatable way to push the classical language into more and more utilitarian buildings, even governmental buildings, banks, things like that, libraries, because it was a nice kit of parts to have in terms of the formal language of the classics. Okay, so now we'll take that lawn area past the walkway here, and it has a little bit of that dark to base it. And now this is tricky. It's only a very little bit, but it shows how this box returns. This corner is right about here. So now we're going to come back to the left vanishing point and show the end of that. So the lawn comes out to meet it. And then we'll have a walkway that goes out this way. So just in a little tiny sliver, we're going to show more movement of darks and lights in that ground plane. And we'll carry that out here later on in the sketch. Okay, underside the arch over here, just like we did there, start with the dark at the top and then bring it down to infill that area because it's getting no light at all. It's in the shade side of the building and it's under a very deep, dark underside here and then kind of flows down toward the interior markings of that as we develop that as a nice dark for it. And then in the foreground here, it's just a big, nice grass esplanade. And then a gravel walkway that's on axis here on both sides of the main stair. So that'll come over here and pitch its way back to Vicenza. And then that's the grass on one side. And now we've got the markings of grass on this side, which we'll kind of build out later. But just to remember to come back to that, we'll kind of start it really quickly here as a nice base zone. Okay, so now 5 through 9, we work on building into the deeper richness of the values here. So we'll simply work left to right. One of the key aspects at the top here is going in the underside and the line work for the closer part. So we see more of the underside of the pediment here. And that projects over the entablature a little bit. Then each column capital has got a little bit of a shadow line of where the ionic order is casting a shadow on itself, and then a little bit of line work between them. I'll help move them around. And then there's a little bit of depth between this last column and seen through in the distance here because you'll actually see that arch on the other side. So this little bit of light, we'll see the underside of this arch and then the side wall here. And what we drew on earlier was that front door and then 2 little windows on the side of that. We'll highlight that more. Come back and do the base every time. We're going to do kind of what we've drawn already, but just do less of it each time. So this one's going to end with a line that's closer to us. And this one's sort of a darker tone of its twin stair that's going to rise up. The elements up here kind of flush right where the first tread starts. So right about this point, there's sort of a diagonal. We see the first couple of risers kind of moving up here. And now take where that meets the grass is going to be an important line. Come back to that window. Come back to the attic windows. And now the underside of the roof line. And the underside of the roof line here. And probably we'll eventually build out this value with probably 6th or 7th as corner to really make that the biggest exchange of dark to light in the sketch, because that's closest to us. And that's the crispness of this edge. Even though it's the same material, it's in our shade side, and we wanted to drive that to this corner. Then up to the attic windows across the way. And we won't see the 4th because it's behind the pediment. We'll 3rd, but we'll see the 4th over here. The underside, make sure you're leaving space so it's brighter for the statues we'll put in later. The underside of the rim of the cylinder, strengthen that up on both sides. The final little finial top for the top of the dome and maybe just this side of it. And then the edge Probably pull from this side, just using the fine tip of the marker, and make sure you edge this side stronger than sort of the sun area over on the other side of the roofing. And then we pull the edge of this arch down, because we can see beyond the wall of the arch into the back heightened area. And what we're going to do is draw a little bit of a line work there, because that's actually the underside of the roof of the pediment itself. And since that's a different plane, it receives even less light than the perpendicular wall beneath it. So that goes darkest of all. And now we come back in and very detailed wise, we pull in that major front door right behind the silhouette of a front sculpture. So that'll hold that for now, and then we'll detail that with more value. So even though it's drawn asymmetric in this drawing, you get a sense it's still on axis between these two columns, because that's the view coming in from this diagonal in terms of the perspective here. And then we've got our view of this window on the first floor, and the one outside the outside wall, right there. The break line for the cornice and the pediment on the other side, and we'll edge that part of the building, we'll edge that column and make sure, again, I drew the line in first, now the line disappears because there's no value to go against it. No sense doing value out here unless it touches the building proper. And that's how we eliminate our original lines in all of our sketches. So we'll keep coming to this as we go up to 9. We just make it stronger and stronger here. And on the underside of this again, and make sure that edge is stronger and this edge is stronger. And then we'll work again to make that a real dynamic move between that white and this becoming darker. It's got a bit of a change of stone quality that makes it a little bit darker on this bottom section here. So remember that. And now we'll have the cast shadow coming down. So what happens is it's coming down at an angle. So it wants to project just like a flat would be here, but it's actually going up at the same time. So the shadow is least at the base. And then it comes out a certain distance. Then it hits this point, and that point starts to recede back to this corner. So in a very strange way, you're actually drawing a triangle. So within that triangle, we'll keep some of the white of the stair treads so they read. And we'll simply move the lines across it. And now I think you'll see that that's seems like this block now is casting a shadow on a diagonal movement of stairs here. And so that's important to us. And we'll bring a little bit of movement of those treads kind of sporadically here, because they are all made of individual stones, and change the texture of it right towards the top for now. At the base, it gets even darker and stronger because there's probably tree trunks that'll move up. And so we want to have the trees come down and be able to see through the base of the trees in the distance here. Whereas this is actually blocked by a little half wall. So it's very, very bright next to it. We're still trying to use the idea of light and then dark and light and dark to move the eye going back into the drawing. And now we can move up to number 6. So we'll reverse the method now. We'll start over on the right side. And now we're thinking more about the shape of the trees. Right now, they're kind of flat and vertically. So we'll make sure that we can sectionalize them into thinking, here's the bottom of a tree in the foreground. And then on the distance behind it, there's the throw of light on that foreground tree. And they're not subjects really, they're just sort of cast characters that support the building proper. So it's just the idea of seeing trees in mass. If they came closer to us or in the foreground, then you can start to talk about species. For now, we just want the value to work for us. And so we want that value stronger right at the base of those before it goes into the forest. And it becomes less important up here, so we probably just leave that from the original 20% we drew. What's really important now is come right to that edge and make it as dark as possible. the top and bottom, because then it makes that wall brighter and brighter, being the twin of this one. And potentially then at the grass line, we'll just pull some horizontal lines out a little bit darker along the way too. And now we'll come up to our original shade wall there, and we'll make that a bit darker. And thin it up now because I overextended its thickness, so I can always trim that down with more dark. Do the same here. And not the whole way back, but certainly a certain distance, and then use more pressure on the marker now as you get to the key corner. Because it's the same gray we perceive realistically, but it makes this edge seem darker and makes the paper seem whiter if you gradate it toward that edge. Now we'll come up into it. We'll project the heights of the windows and the side that's receiving less light. A little deeper in. You see the underside of that arch, which makes for a pretty good dark line at the end of that column. Into that column too. Probably the right side of all these will be defined by that dark behind them. Come up top again. Push more interest into that front door. And now we're not sort of filling in the high space, we're sort of going top to bottom and again trying to gradate that as well. Here's the underside of that arch, and then that little ribbon of dark and contrast next to it. This side projects back, we'll kick that out more. Probably the dental level here would be difficult to draw on those. There's probably 30 dentals going across. We'll just leave them as a massive gray for now. Same is true underneath the top of the pediment. There's some detail up there. And a couple of little probably eyelet openings there to vent that space. And then the sculptural piece up there eventually. So we'll do that next with the end of number 5 before we get to 6. This window, maybe have a little bit of curtain work would make it lighter, then the lower half might be a view into it, so you could kind of change the language of that. In one basement window, there's an arch, shallow arch, that you walk in for the lower level, and that's all fairly dark by then. Again, redrawing the things we did before as you kind of build up the language. There's that important cast shadow. The attic windows hit again. The underside strengthens. Borderline's important. And maybe pulling from this corner, if this light's coming down, it's hitting this corner and going back in diagonal to the base of this. So the connection between this coming out of that point and down and this coming back over gives you a diagonal right there. So it's a very thin strip of a triangle. That nice cast shadow kind of, again, sits the building down and makes that light a little more poignant. So maybe we come back on the right side of each column and then fade off with the number 5 here. Makes that portico a little bit deeper and richer. So off we go to, and that was 60 there. We'll go to 7 now. And our timing is shorter on each one of these more powerful ones. Let's go left to right now. Just go to the base, the vegetation in the background. Make sure it meets that wall and shows that space. I think we could probably just move through this at a rapid pace now to show those 3 darks in there. Probably the underside of this arch is one of the primary darks as well. That side view of that attic windows, the side windows. Certainly the underside of that E receives less light, and then the right side, which we see more, is actually in shade 2. Just do a wall of dark. The right side, the tops of the attics. It turns the corner over here where it meets. And this side, the sun comes down and casts a higher shadow on this part of the dentals than it does on its opposite side. Corner. Over here and edge that, edge this. Bring that dark so we had before right to the corner of the building now. Drop it down to the ground. Yep. That edge. Right there too. Back to that shadow where it's deep. And now on the underside, we did a tone to say it's dark inside there, but now if we do a little bit darker beyond the initial rim, it'll help, move the idea that it's a place you actually can move into, because that's about the height of a person. It's probably a 6-foot opening there. So it seems kind of cramped, but actually there's a whole array of functions here which serve the performance of the room up above. And number 8, so we get a lot more detailed here. We want to pull out that dark between those that runs down. Upside of that. Right where it touches grade. And before we go to 9, let's drop back to 4 for now and look at the statuary. So they're all human figures, and there's no way you want to spend time articulating all that, but you want to deal with the idea that there's a torso, there's legs, there's a finite small head, and there's a shade side for all of this. So if you start with any of them, let's just go to the top here and go to your point. There's always a shadow on the one side of the head and then the back side of the torso, probably at the base of the torso on a part of the legs. And then sometimes they're holding stuff out in space, or they're doing something theatrical. So you can add to the view in terms of legs. And that's all you really need there, because it reads as a statue. This one is, again, left side of the torso, maybe it casts shadow on itself, and it sits on a little bit of a flat plane on top. It can't sit on a diagonal, so there's a little bit of a pedestal for a ball here. So that has a side to it too. And so you're just sort of hinting at the form making for it. And even that kind of cartoon idea for it at least sells the idea that it's a statued content here. And again, nothing to call it subject, but it does create the interest and shows the commitment that Palladio had to the classical language. And then at the edge of the stairs, here's our last one in front on this side. And that side. And now we'll bring these columns to the ground. We'll start with the 4 here, maybe do a little detail in a second. But when they come down to the ground, there's going to be, since Ionic, it does have a base to it, the Doric don't. So there is a ribbon for the end of the column, and it sits on its base. So it does have a little bit of profile right down here, which is darker than the column itself. And so you want the ones you can see, you want that to be received. And now I have to come down and make sure that the base of the column is actually darker than the wall behind it. So it pulls off of it. So bring those lines down and have it meet the base you've just drawn in. And that's that piece. And as long as you have the floor out, we'll come back and do strengthen up the lawn a little bit here adjacent to the building. And then take it out this way a bit. And just start strong next here and draw those lines back. And now number 9, the very last little finishing touches where the absolute black goes. So either you can squint at the building now and see if there's a problem with it popping off your page. Where can you add some more dark to where the dark always is? Or now you just spend about 45 seconds putting black inside the black. And really the darkest darks are usually going to be what you see, the little bit you can see the interior from here. Will really chase the eye back towards that. So let's say the top section of the mantle to enter the building is an typically enclosed piece, and the aperture for it is lower and behind it. So if you put it absolute black adjacent here, that means the door might be swung open, which makes it a very dark behind the statue. And so again, that takes the eye into the sense of interiority. So maybe the bottom section of here is more open and it's sheltered up above on that window. Same is true here. The current owners might have some type of drapery up there. And that helps you, that kind of interior then perform on the outside skin of the building. And I can come back to 20 or 30 and just come to our edges and wash those in so that they're stronger. And we get some of the line work of it. It's just a patchwork of stucco out here, so give the stucco some texture. Probably at this point, this whole piece doesn't receive much light at all until we get out to this line would come over here. And this whole skin is in shade. And wash that out a bit. So if the media is too prominent, let's come back in and bleed it together. I think I'll do that with a little bit of 3 on top of that now too. So the alcohol again is just taking the earlier ink, kind of warming it up one more time so it kind of bleeds together a bit. Now you might want to take the 4 now and just enhance this corner, even though they are both very brilliant adjacent to each other. You want to make the turn to the box there, that there is some space between this and that new column dentures over on this side. And last little bit, probably just with the number 4, go to the tops of the columns and show a little move of those ionic volutes, which act as sort of like large ears on the side of it. And they tend to curl down and have a little shadow cast underneath them. You won't see much detail over here on this one either, but certainly the 6 up front. And then they hold the entablature up above. And you come back to the stair and do a little bit of line work in there so it's not quite so white, because it is a darker stone than the skin of the building or the stucco work. And we wanted to make sure that right at the top, there's a good break between the value of the stair and then the white of the backdrop. So we see that really strong white coming back there. So maybe to push that back a bit. There we go. A little bit of line work back into the roof line, since it is all thousands of individualized pieces. So just some texture with your marker at this corner where we're closer to it. And make sure we edge it over here. And I think it's so powerful by itself and so geometric and pure that we don't need to really enhance it more with the sky, because it just sort of drops off on the backside toward a really low finito sky. If anything, we'd come in with a 2 and just to eliminate this line, for instance, we'd come in right way in the back and say, maybe there's cloud cover a certain distance away, but it's going to be more lineal and vanishing back to the past here, further and further away here. So it might be part just on this part of the sketch, but we don't need much above it. So the panoramic visions of trees, meadows, and woods with Vicenza on the horizon is just a great sort of architectural essay. I wouldn't call it a residence. It's really more of an entertainment villa where the people lived in town and then had events out here. It's just sort of a great, perfect geometric architectural exercise, which has become heroic in the annals of Western culture.